Greetings, students. Welcome to Week 7, Module 7 of our graduate class on significant events of World War II. Today we are focused on Operation Overlord, which occurred between June and July 1944. As always, I've added a set of slides to your folder. It generally follows along my lecture. It includes detailed maps, photographs, and key points of the operation. Please check it out. You had a book chapter and some original documents related to Overlord assigned for this week. I also asked you to watch the classic war movie The Longest Day, as well as the first 3 episodes of the TV series Band of Brothers. I hope that you watch them and it will assist you in thinking more broadly about Overlord. We also have a couple assignments this week, which I'll go over at the end of this video lecture. With that, we'll get started. Operation Overlord was the code name for the Battle of Normandy. The operation was launched on June 6, 1944 and ended in late July 1944 with the Allied breakout from Normandy in Operation Cobra. Overlord led to the liberation of Western Europe from German occupation. It took pressure off the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front and contributed to Germany's unconditional surrender less than a year later. Overlord was the largest amphibious invasion in military history, with more than 5,000 vessels involved. A 1,200 plane airborne assault with troops from 3 divisions preceded the amphibious landing. Nearly 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel on June 6th, and more than 2 million Allied troops were in France by the end of August. We tend to call Operation Overlord D-Day, which is misleading since every operation has a D-Day, which just means the first day of the operation. Throughout 1942 and 43, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin pushed President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill to open a second front as soon as possible to relieve pressure off Soviet forces fighting on the Eastern Front. This followed the German invasion of the Soviet Union, called Operation Barbarossa, in June 1941. The urgency for the Soviet Union related to a second front was a matter of life and death for that country. The Soviet Union had already suffered millions of military and civilian casualties. To emphasize his perspective on the need for a second front, Stalin skipped the Casablanca Conference in January 1942. The decision to undertake a cross-channel invasion in 1944 was made at the Trident Conference in Washington, D.C. in May 1943. During this meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill, General Dwight Eisenhower was appointed commander of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and General Bernard Montgomery was named commander of the 21st Army Group, which included all of the land forces involved in Overlord. The coast of Normandy in northwestern France was chosen as the site of the amphibious assault, with the Americans assigned to land at sectors called Utah and Omaha, the British at Sword and Gold, and the Canadians and Free French at Juno. It was not until the Tehran Conference in November and December 1943 there was an agreement on when Overlord was going to start. The initial start date was set for May 1944. The Pas-de-Calais area of France is the closest to continental Europe from the UK, and was the location of launch sites for German V-1 and V-2 rockets. The Germans regarded Calais as the most likely initial landing zone and made it the most fortified as part of its coastal defense called the Atlantic Wall. Adolf Hitler placed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in charge of developing fortifications along the Atlantic Wall in anticipation of landings in France. It was also here that Hitler put the bulk of his panzer divisions after being tipped off by Allied undercover agents posing as German sympathizers that the invasion would take place in the Calais region. In his work to build up the Atlantic Wall, Rommel oversaw the construction of a defensive belt which included thousands of concrete bunkers and pillboxes with heavy and fast-firing artillery, tens of thousands of tank ditches, millions of mines, and other formidable beach obstacles. On the other hand, since the landing was expected at Calais, and since the area offered the Allies few opportunities for expansion, as it is bounded by numerous canals and rivers, the Allies chose Normandy as a landing site. The most serious setback related to the Normandy coast was its lack of port facilities, but the Allies came up with a plan on how to overcome that, and that was through the construction and deployment of artificial harbors called mulberries. Mulberries were one of many Allied innovations used in Overlord. Chief of Staff to the Commander, Supreme Commander, or Cossack, was the staff that planned the invasion. On December 31st, 1943, Eisenhower and Montgomery first saw the Cossack Plan, which proposed amphibious landings by 3 divisions with 2 more divisions in support. The 2 generals insisted on expanding the scale of the initial invasion to 5 divisions with airborne operations by 3 additional divisions to allow a wider front and to speed up the capture of the port at Cherbourg. This significant expansion required the acquisition of additional landing craft, which caused the invasion to be delayed by a month until June of 1944. The challenges of mounting a successful landing were daunting. Surprise was an essential element of the Allied invasion plan. If the Germans had known where and when the Allies were coming, they would have been able to stop the landing. To maintain the element of surprise in the months leading up to the landings, the Allies conducted Operation Fortitude, a major deception operation that used electronic and visual misinformation to mislead the Germans as to the date and location of the invasion. The Allies created an entire phantom army based in southeastern England opposite Pas de Calais and publicized that it was commanded by U.S. General George S. Patton. The invasion was supported by more than 13,000 Allied fighter, bomber, and transport aircraft, which on D-Day faced less than 400 German Luftwaffe aircraft. Between April 1st and June 5th, British and American strategic air forces deployed 11,000 aircraft, flew 200,000 sorties, and dropped 195,000 tons of bombs on French rail centers and rail networks, as well as German airfields, destroying aircraft, and German radar installations, military bases, and coastal artillery batteries. This air campaign succeeded in isolating the invasion area from the rest of France and destroying a good chunk of the Luftwaffe. This was significant in that it limited German forces from being able to be reinforced. The English Channel was notorious, or is notorious, for its rough seas and unpredictable weather. Allied leaders had set the date for the June 5th, 1944, but on the morning of June 4th, bad weather over the Channel forced Eisenhower to postpone the attack for 24 hours. The delay was unnerving for soldiers, sailors, and airmen, but when meteorologists forecast a brief window of clearer weather over the Channel on June 6th, Eisenhower made the decision to go. Just after midnight on June 6th, U.S. and British airborne forces began dropping behind enemy lines. The U.S. 82nd and 101st landed near Utah Beach to the west, while the British 6th Airborne Division landed to the east in support of Sword Beach. Their jobs were to prevent German forces from rushing reinforcements to the invasion beaches. Hours later, the largest amphibious landing force ever assembled closed in on the landing beaches. The fiercest fighting was on Omaha Beach, where the enemy was positioned on steep cliffs that commanded the long, flat shoreline. U.S. troops were pinned down for hours by murderous machine gun fire that turned the beach into a killing field. By midday, the Americans had taken Omaha Beach, but at a heavy cost. Over 4,700 were killed, wounded, or missing out of a total of approximately 35,000 that came ashore that day, a loss rate of more than 13%. Meanwhile, the German High Command, in the absence of Rommel, who was home on leave, began to respond. Hitler was initially unwilling to release the Panzer forces for a counterattack. When he finally relented, elements of the 21st Panzer Division drove into the gap between the British 3rd and Canadian 3rd Divisions at Sword and Juno beaches and almost reached the sea. Had they done so, the landings may have failed. The Allies failed to accomplish their initial day objectives, but gained a tenuous foothold that they gradually expanded. On June 7th, the beachhead consisted of 3 separate sectors, that of the British and Canadians between Gold and Sword beaches, the area around Omaha Beach, and that of Utah Beach. It was not until June 12th that American forces were able to link up between Utah and Omaha Beach near Carenton. The beachhead was then formed as a continuous zone, its deepest point being southwest of Bayeux, where Allied forces had driven nearly 15 miles inland. The port of Cherbourg was captured on June 26th and the city of Caen on July 7th. By July 25th, reinforcements gave the Allies superiority in tank and infantry divisions, while the Allied Expeditionary Force had the bombardment power to devastate any Germans in their path. Operation Cobra, which began on July 25th, opened with a devastating air attack. Through that gap, George S. Patton led the newly formed Third Army to join and lead the advance. Operation Overlord was over. In the next month, a failed counterattack by German forces in response to Allied troops left 50,000 German soldiers surrounded at the Falaise pocket. The Allies launched a second invasion from the Mediterranean Sea in southern France, codenamed Operation Dragoon, on August 15th, and the liberation of Paris followed on August 25th. What is controversial about Operation Overlord? I want you to consider what you think about Overlord. As Americans, we tend to think of it as a majority U.S. operation that opened Western Europe, led to the defeat of Germany, and ended the war. We can be very ethnocentristic. It's not a bad thing. It's great that peoples think their countries or the culture are the best, but sometimes that ethnocentrism leads to some very skewed perspectives, and I think that's the case for many Americans related to Overlord. Yes, Overlord opened a second front to take pressure off the Eastern Front. We have talked about the Eastern Front in a couple of our previous classes. There were more forces committed there than any other theater of war in human history. The fighting involved millions of Axis and Soviet troops along the broadest land front in military history. This front included some of the history's largest battles, most horrific atrocities, and highest casualties, all of which influenced the course of World War II and subsequently the history of the 20th century and impacts us still to today. There were more than 8 million military deaths on the Soviet side. Axis military deaths were approximately 5 million, of which 80% were German. The German army captured about 5 million Soviet troops and deliberately starved to death or otherwise killed over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Estimated civilian deaths range from 14 to 17 million. Additionally, the Nazis exterminated 1 to 2 million Jews from the region as part of the Holocaust. So while a worthy operation that played a significant role in the Allies' victory in World War II, we need to make sure that we keep it in context overall. So why does Overlord matter? It marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe after 4 years of German occupation. As the phrase Second Front implies, this meant that Germany had two fights. Two fronts meant that what was left of German troops, equipment, and national will was spread even thinner. Overlord is a great study in combined arms warfare as well as coalition and joint operations. Overlord remains the greatest amphibious invasion in history thanks to naval contributions of many countries. Overlord was successful due to the efforts of airmen who broke the Luftwaffe, crippled enemy transportation, gathered intelligence, and directly supported Allied ground forces. The significance of intelligence played out in Overlord. The Germans were deceived with a phantom army, double agents, and fraudulent radio transmissions. After 4 years of occupation, the French people were able to contribute to their own freedom as French resistance and French civilians helped the Allies advance through their country. The invasion of Normandy is significant due to its sheer size and scale. To describe the invasion as audacious understates the precarious one-shot, roll-of-the-dice nature. At the tactical level, the Allies prepared for the attack almost within eyesight of German forces. At their closest point, Britain and the European coast are less than 20 miles away. Many of the German radar sets could easily have spotted ships and aircraft moving across the English Channel. Portsmouth and Southampton, two of the major ports used by British forces for the operation, are only 100 miles from Normandy. In today's strategic environment, that would be the same as launching an invasion from Taiwan towards mainland China. Overlord posed the likelihood of strategic and political failure. If German forces had succeeded in stopping the Allies, the chance of a follow-on Allied attack within a year or two was extremely remote, meaning the war's end would have been years delayed. With that, I remind you of your week's homework, a discussion post about Overlord, and our big paper is also due this week.